Good evening and warm welcome. My name is Elena Vogman. I'm visiting fellow at ICI Berlin, and it's my honor and real delight to open this evening titled Notes for a Séance, Technology of the Spirit, dedicated to practices and attempts to make contact with voices and worlds beyond the living through the agency of a medium, in particular through the medium of cinema. The evening is divided in two parts. In the first part, Biennale artistic directors Anton Vidokle, Hallie Ayres, and Lukas Brasiskis will discuss their ongoing research for the 13th Seoul Mediacity Biennale. Each of their presentations will be intercepted by a film screening. After this, we will have a 15-minute break, and in the second half of the evening, artist Mellito풀lo스는 and myself will present some perspectives on cinematic and cine-somatic seances, relating these, among other things, to the movement of institutional psychotherapy and its political and geopsychiatric implications. So following this, we'll have a Q&A with the audience. And yes, I would now introduce all the speakers of today's session. First of all, Anton Vidokle is an artist, filmmaker, and the founding director of Efflux. He has worked and exhibited in many places, but also in South Korea, even numerous times, including 2 editions of the Guangzhou Biennale, where he won the Noon Award in 2016, as well as a solo show at MACA in 2019, and other exhibitions, lectures, and projects, which are maybe too numerous to be introduced here. So Hallie Ayres is a curator, researcher, and art historian who has published text and delivered lectures on the reconciliation of indigenous and Western knowledge production through spiritual belief systems, among many other topics. Lukas Brasiskis is a PhD scholar and film curator. His work is devoted to artists and experimental film. In his curatorial and academic work, he often explores the limits and potentials of moving image practices. In particular, he's interested in more than human perspectives, a topic he discussed in his essay for the Art Contemplating Crisis, MMCA Studies Special Edition in 2020, among other writings. Mellito풀lo스는 is artist and researcher in the time-based arts, including experimental single-channel tapes, video installations, video essays, documentaries, and sound pieces. In her practice, she explores the production of subjectivity and collective memory in the context of mobility, migration, and geography. And she worked also on a film and exhibition on animism, which I think has a particular relation to this evening's program. And at this point, I would like to welcome the first speaker, Anton. Please join me in welcoming Anton.
Hi, it's very nice to be back here at ICI. Many thanks to Elena for organizing this, and of course to ICI for hosting this event. The Stoke grows out of the thinking behind the upcoming Seoul Mediacity Biennale, but it isn't a curatorial overview. Instead, it's a kind of a companion, an attempt to trace some of the questions that have been with me during its preparation. The exhibition will unfold through multiple narratives and topics, and it will primarily speak through works of art. The Stoke takes one of those threads, death and the possibility of contact with the dead, and follows it more intimately through philosophy, history, and art. It doesn't aim to explain the show, but to present some of the context. The centrality of death, the desire for immortality, and the impulse to communicate with the dead have shaped both art and spirituality since prehistory. One might argue that many of the earliest works we now regard as art were originally created to commemorate, to remember, to hold on to that which is passing. This funerary impulse is not unique to modern humans. Neanderthals are thought to have decorated burial sites with flowers, while chimpanzees and elephants have been observed arranging leaves and branches over deceased members of their groups. Nikolai Fyodorov, the 19th century Russian philosopher, speculated that music, dance, and singing originated from burial chants and laments, and that many visual art forms followed from the same impulse. Even the word image comes from the Latin imago, the death masks used in ancient Rome to represent ancestors and displayed in public spaces of noble households. Excavations at Neolithic sites like Catalhoyuk and Jericho unearthed skulls covered in white plaster, some painted with, the slides. This is the skull. I think this one is from Jericho. Some painted with ochre and inlaid with seashells in the eye sockets. Both eerie and beautiful, these were often buried beneath the floors of living quarters, suggesting a desire not to distance the dead, but to keep them close. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in the same region about 5,000 years ago, and used for millennia as a part of a cult, is the oldest literary work known to us. It tells of a king devastated by the death of his friend Enkidu, who embarks on a journey to find a way to overcome mortality. He encounters gods and demons, and finally Utnapishtim, a Noah-like figure who saved humanity from the Great Flood. But there is no elixir of life. Instead, what endures is the story itself, as a poem, as a work of art. True religion is a cult of ancestors, Fyodorov once said. Perhaps art has always been a part of that cult. In his 1920 essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Sigmund Freud made the provocative claim that the aim of all life is death. He meant this quite literally. Freud speculated that since life emerged from inorganic matter, it carries within it a drive to return to that original inanimate state. Beneath the instincts of pleasure and survival, he proposed, lies a fundamental death drive. This theory diverged sharply from Darwin's model of survival and adoption, but it resonates with many spiritual and artistic traditions that center death as both problem and the portal, a threshold towards something beyond. Arthur Schopenhauer and his concept of the will, a blind, insatiable force driving all life and suffering, echoes Freud's death drive. Yet Schopenhauer saw art as one of the few ways to momentarily transcend the cycle. In aesthetic experience, he argued, we're lifted out of desire and compulsions and enter a state of contemplative detachment. Aesthetic pleasure in the beautiful, he wrote, consists to a large extent in the fact that we are, so to speak, rid of ourselves. We are, so to speak, rid of ourselves. But isn't being rid of ourselves a kind of death? This idea of dissolving the self to become a vessel for something beyond is deeply resonant with artists and closely mirrors spiritual traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism. According to traditional accounts, the Buddha left his home after encountering 4 sights: a sick person, an old person, a corpse, and an ascetic. These visions presented both the inevitability of death and the possibility of transcendence. The greatest problem, then as now, was mortality and the hope of overcoming it. Georges Bataille also saw transcendence through loss and dissolution, particularly through sacrifice. In The Accursed Share, he describes Sun's boundless generosity, its continual outpouring of energy, as a cosmic surplus that must be expended, sometimes violently, in order for life to sustain itself. His theory of sacrificial expenditure echoes Marquis de Sade's vision of annihilating nature to start anew, or Kazimir Malevich's call to burn down all museums so that art might be reborn from their ashes. This radical logic also underpins Soviet philosophers Evald Ilinkov's cosmology of the spirit, which envisions a final act of self-sacrifice, the destruction of the world to repay a metaphysical debt to nature, thereby initiating a new cosmic cycle, an artificial Big Bang. Nietzsche's idea of eternal return also lingers here, the compulsion to repeat to renew, to pass again through death as a way to begin. It is through the act of sacrifice that the sacred is produced, while mystical experience always entails a certain dissolution of the subject, also a death in a sense. Something similar appears to happen with trance and spiritism sessions, where the body of the medium must be vacated of their individual persona to let something else enter. This is also true of many shamanic traditions, including the gut ritual in Korea, where the mudang must be possessed by the spirit. Spiritualist and psychoanalytic sessions, as well as cinema screenings, are often described using the word séance, a French term referring to a gathering where contact is attempted with the dead or otherworldly beings through a gifted medium. The word was already in use in the 18th century to describe Franz Mesner's therapeutic sessions of animal magnetism. Emerging alongside modernism, spiritualism, and with it the occult, mysticism, and new syncretic religions captured both popular and avant-garde imagination. This fascination was in part response to the disorienting transformation of industrialization and modernity. Life was being reshaped by rationalism, regimentation, and mechanization, prompting a counter-desire for mystery, emotion, and escape. We see this in artists across early modernism, from the theosophy of Piet Mondrian to the anthroposophy of Hilma af Klint. Af Klint was a part of a group of 5 women in Sweden who used seances to communicate with the spirits they believed to be Mahatmas, transmitting lost knowledge. While they started with automatic writing, their practice soon expanded to art. Af Klint claimed that in her paintings for the Temple series of groundbreaking abstract works, they were created under spiritual direction, painted, and this is to quote her, painted directly through me without any preliminary drawings and with great force. Approximately 50 years earlier, around 1861, another female medium, Georgiana Houghton, already started making abstract paintings on paper. Signed with the names of dead members of her family that she was channeling, these paintings are masterful abstractions that represent otherworldly states and passages, which she made with no previous artistic training or experience. Spiritualism emerged as a religious and social movement in the 19th century New York. It held that consciousness persists after death, and that spirits not only endure, but continue evolving. Drawing from Swedenborg's writings and Mesmer's panpsychic ideas, it grew rapidly. The movement traces its origin to March 31st, 1848, when 2 young sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox, reported spirit contact through mysterious knocks in their homes. Abolitionists Amy and Isaac Post, Quakers in Rochester, took the girls in and became their first public supporters. Their home, a stop on the Underground Railroad, connected spiritualism with early movement for emancipation and women's rights. From its beginning, spiritualism was inseparable from radical politics and was primarily shaped by women. The world sounds. It is a cosmos of spiritually active beings. Even dead matter is living spirit, wrote Vasily Kandinsky in 1912. His treatise on the spiritual and art outlined a theory of abstraction shaped by theosophical belief, particularly the idea of thought forms, immaterial objects produced by concentrated emotion and intention. This concept, articulated by Annie Besant, a disciple of Elena Blavatsky, drew from Buddhist notions of mental aggregates and karma. Besant described thought forms as entities born of mental energy, and to quote Besant, every thought becomes an active entity by associating itself with an elemental, a creature of the mind's begetting, a world crowded with the offspring of fancies, desires, impulses, and passions. These forms, she believed, endure and influence other beings they encounter. While adepts could consciously generate them, most people produce them unconsciously. Besant co-authored a book on the subject with C.W. Leadbeater, entitled Thought Forms and accompanied by illustrations from John Varley, Eugenia McFarlane, and others. These images, vibrational, diagrammatic, and strangely prescient of 20th century abstraction, are not just representations, but tools, methods for perceiving the invisible. Elena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, was born in 1831 in Dnipro, in the present-day Ukraine, the same town where my mother grew up. I spent time there as a child in the 1970s and recall nothing mystical about it. Yet by 1870s, Blavatsky had become a central figure in global spiritualism. She merged Western occultism and Eastern metaphysics, particularly Buddhism, and co-founded the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875. Her impact on 20th century culture, especially the visual arts, was vast. She was one of the first thinkers to synthesize Western and Eastern esoteric traditions, a tendency that remains dominant in alternative spirituality to this day. Annie Besant, her successor, was equally complex. A theosophist, a socialist, feminist, decolonial activist, Freemason, and a medium, she eventually became the president of the Theosophical Society in 1908. In 1904, she appointed Rudolf Steiner to lead the esoteric school in Germany and Austria. Eventually, Rudolf Steiner insisted on a more Eurocentric focus, emphasizing Christianity, something that Blavatsky and Besant opposed. This led to a break with Theosophy in 1912 and the founding of the Anthroposophical Society, based in Dornach, Switzerland. Interestingly, the split began over a disagreement in the interpretation of artistic expression. The influence of Theosophy and Anthroposophy on art reflects a broader synthesis of Eastern and Western religious thought, from Buddhism and Christianity to Sufism and shamanism. It's no surprise that in the post-World War II period, many artists turned towards spiritual practices in Asia, from Zen to newer syncretic movements like Oomoto. Oomoto Kyo emerged in the late 19th century Japan, founded by Deguchi Nao, an illiterate peasant woman from Ayabe in Kyoto Prefecture. On New Year's Day in 1892, she became possessed by a divine spirit and began recording its messages through automatic writing. These writings were interpreted by her son-in-law, Deguchi Onisaburo, a mystic who married into the family and adopted its name. What is remarkable about Oomoto is its emphasis on art. Matrilinear by structure, each spiritual leader must be an artist, trained in calligraphy, ceramics, traditional theater, or tea ceremony. The religion is pacifist and universalist. It opposed Japan's military government and was banned during World War II, and its leaders were imprisoned and tortured. In 1924, Oomoto even replaced Japanese language with Esperanto as its sacred language. From the late 1970s through 1980s, it ran an international summer art school, attracting figures like Buckminster Fuller. Automatic writing, hypnosis, and trance were central techniques in the Surrealist movement, which sought to bypass rational thought and access deeper psychic currents. André Breton famously defined Surrealism as psychic automatism in its pure state, a method for revealing the unconscious mind. But Surrealism's engagement with mysticism was not merely aesthetic, it was politically charged. In the 1930s, as fascism spread across Europe, Georges Bataille launched the journal Acéphale, named after the mythic headless figure that served as its emblem. The figure symbolized a rejection of Enlightenment rationalism and the sovereign ego in favor of primal embodied being. Acéphale was conceived not only as a publication, but as an occult society, where sacredness could be reclaimed through ritual, secrecy, and transgression. According to legend, Bataille believed that the launch of Acéphale required a real human sacrifice to fulfill its symbolic power. He asked for volunteers. Nobody came forward. The shamanic dimension of art continued into the 20th century with figures like Emma Kunz and Joseph Beuys, who approached artistic practice as a form of healing and energetic alignment. Kunz created intricate geometric drawings used for diagnostic and spiritual purposes, while Beuys framed his performances and pedagogical activities as acts of social and ecological repair. Namjoon Paik similarly invoked shamanism in his pioneering work with video and electronic media, transforming technology into a conduit for ritual and intuition. In the final days of World War II, Anisaburo Deguchi, the spiritual leader of the Oomoto religion, created thousands of vividly glazed ceramic tea bowls. For Oomoto, art is not simply expression, but a channel of divine presence within human realm. The surfaces of Deguchi's bowls are densely textured with small indentations made by reed pens and needles, each marking the recitation of a prayer, an act of inscription that merges self, ritual, and material. The luminous acid-like glazes are said to have been inspired by the eerie colors of the sky as seen from the mountains near Kyoto during the bombing of Osaka. Today, we're once again living through a profound transformation of life and perception, this time driven by digitalization, algorithmic automation, and artificial intelligence. As with earlier technological upheavals, these shifts have brought about widespread anxiety, disorientation, and a renewed sense of alienation. The global resurgence of nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism are one symptom of this deeper unease. In response, many contemporary artists are turning once again to mysticism, spirituality, and non-human ways of knowing to make sense of the present. Artists such as Joanna Hedwa, Jane Jin Kaysen, and Yinju Chen draw from spiritual, esoteric, and ancestral traditions as part of sustained investigations into illness, diaspora, memory, and resistance. Hedwa's work connects chronic illness with occult knowledge and care practices, using performance, text, and sound to explore what they describe as the politics of vulnerability. Jane Jin Kaysen often engages shamanism and inherited trauma through film and installation, particularly in relation to the history of Jeju Island and its 4.3 massacre. Her work approaches ritual not as a reenactment, but as a form of historical transmission. Yinju Chen combines astrology, Taoist cosmology, and political history to examine how power and belief intersect. Across these practices, spirituality is not framed as otherworldly, but as a structure for making sense of violence, loss, and the possibility of repair. Our aim with the 13th Seoul Mediacity Biennale is to produce an exhibition as a séance, a project that not only presents historical and contemporary artistic practices and discourses that draw on the occult, mystical, and spiritual traditions, but an exhibition that enters into a conversation with multiple realms that exist within and beyond the human world, and hopefully through art give spaces to the voices of the dead and their emancipatory potential. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Lukas. So I'll start here. The desire to communicate with the dead is as old as human civilization, woven into myths, rituals, and spiritual traditions across cultures and centuries. However, in the modern era, this impulse took on a new form with the rise of a spiritualist movement, or spiritist movement, as it is known in parts of Europe. Etymologically, the French word séance simply means sitting. Originally, starting from the mid-19th century, the word referred to a gathering to summon spirits, basically a spiritualist séance. Yet it has soon come to designate other types of séances or sittings, such as the psychoanalytical séance and the cinematic séance. What I want to particularly focus on today is the cinematic séance, but to draw its connections to the spiritual and psychoanalytical predecessors of the séance, I will start from the latter two. Yeah. As Anton has already mentioned in his presentation, the rise of spiritualism in the 19th century emerged in response to a cultural and religious void left by ascendance of scientific positivism and industrial capitalism. By the 1880s, Séances had become central to a mass spiritual movement, with an estimated 8 million adherents across the United States and Europe, and very soon spreading to other continents. In dimly lit parlors, mediums were inviting spirits to speak through rapping sounds, trance states, or different methods of manifestations of the dead. These sittings offered both consolation and spectacle, creating situations where contact with the absent, with the dead, with the deceased, worked as both a performative entertainment and, one could say, therapy. The spiritual seance, in this sense, provided the seductive feeling that some deeper order of meaning might still be within reach amidst the drastic societal changes in Western society during the advent of modernity, when daily life has altered drastically and new scientific theories about the world, including Darwinian evolutionary theory and others, challenge established beliefs. It is noteworthy that psychoanalysis, developed by Sigmund Freud and his contemporaries in the late 19th century, emerged under many of the same historical pressures that animated the spiritualist movement. The mass migration from rural life to industrial cities, alongside the strict temporal regimes of factory labor, disrupted traditional perception of time and embodiment. This radical transformation gave rise to new psychological disturbances, fatigues, anxieties, hysteria, and other so-called nervous disorders that often at the time eluded conventional medical treatment. Early psychoanalysis developed as a response to this disorientation of the modern subject. Interestingly, in some cases, early psychotherapists and psychologists drew from techniques used in spiritual sciences. Pierre Janet, for example, employed automatic writing, commonly practiced by spirit mediums, as well as explored trance states to study dissociation and subconscious automatisms. Yet, psychoanalysis ultimately rejected metaphysical explanations. It established a clinical framework for investigating the unconscious. Transference has become a central term for psychoanalytical science. Initially described by Sigmund Freud as the unconscious projection of repressed feelings and desires onto the figure of the analyst, transference became a method for accessing hidden dynamics of the unconscious. Jacques Lacan, way later, reformulated it through the lenses of structural linguistics. The unconscious, he argued, is structured like a language. What is repressed does not return in pure content, but through slips, silences, and certain displacements within language. In this framework, the psychoanalytical seance allows to encounter what resists symbolization, what remains unsaid, yet structures one's traumas, desires, and the repressed. To be clear, this is not to suggest a historical or conceptual derivation of psychoanalysis from spiritualism in terms of spiritualist movement. Rather, I propose that psychoanalysis reconfigured the use of term seance along secular clinical lines, while the spiritualist seance aimed to communicate with entities from a metaphysical beyond. Psychoanalysis addressed what Freud termed the return of the repressed, signals of unconscious conflict emerging from within the subject. If spiritualists once imagined the spirit or the ghost as a visitation from the afterlife, psychoanalysis understood it as a psychic return from within. It is through this understanding of the earlier uses of the term seance that I want to approach another meaning of the word, this time in the end of 19th century made possible by a new technological invention, cinema. The dark theater became a new kind of ritual space in which ephemeral images projected by modern technology conjured a presence out of absence. Here, as I will show in what follows, through writings by Jacques Derrida and Edgar Morin, the cinematic sense inherited aspects of both preceding forms of seance.
Tout ça, c'est aujourd'hui, ça doit se traiter, me semble-t-il, dans un échange entre l'art du cinéma, dans ce qu'il a de plus inouï, de plus inédit finalement, et quelque chose de la psychanalyse. Je crois que cinéma plus psychanalyse égale science du fantôme. Vous savez, Freud, toute sa vie, a eu affaire au problème du fantôme. Tout le développement de la technologie des télécommunications, au lieu de restreindre l'espace des fantômes, comme on pourrait le penser. On pourrait penser que la science, aujourd'hui la technique, laisse derrière eux l'époque des fantômes, qui était l'époque des manoirs, d'une certaine technologie de fruste, enfin d'une certaine époque périmée, alors que je crois au contraire que l'avenir est aux fantômes et que la technologie moderne de l'image, de la cinématographie, de la télécommunication décuple le pouvoir des fantômes, le retour des fantômes.
So, in this clip from the film Ghost Dance, directed by Ken McMullen in 1982, Jacques Derrida famously, I'm sure some of you have seen this before, offers a provocative formula: cinema plus psychoanalysis equals a science of ghosts. This Derrida statement perfectly underscores the structural parallels he draws in quite a few sources between film and psychoanalysis, stressing on their shared engagement with the unconscious through the complex mechanisms of projection. As Derrida further noted in his 1982 interview with journal Cahiers du Cinéma, both types of seances, meaning psychoanalytical and cinematic, grapple with the unsettling return of the repressed. In comparison to psychoanalytical session, he describes film as a medium uniquely attuned to preserve and reanimate traces of the past, creating the uncanny situation where the dead can appear more alive than the living itself. As Derrida writes in the co-authored, together with Bernard Stiegler, introduction to the book Echographies of Television, every time he watches this sequence from the film Ghost Dance, where he talks about the ghost, he experiences uncanny self-referentiality when actress Pascal Augier, who had died a few months after shooting of that scene, reappears again and again on screen answering his question, "Do you believe in ghosts?" That leads him to state that every film, in this sense, is a haunted space. The viewer encounters traces that are no longer, or have never actually been present, as alive. Yet, as Derrida emphasizes, comparing psychoanalysis and cinema, it is extremely important to understand that cinematic transference is based on a double projection. First, the literal and mechanical projection of images onto the screen, and second, the psychological projection of the spectator's own unconscious desires and fantasies onto those images. As a result, Derrida writes, one confronts their own unconscious that they bring to the film theater. In the interview, he even puts sharply but not without humor, and I quote, "A screening seance is only a little longer than an analytical one. You go to the movies to be analyzed by letting all the ghosts appear and speak. You can, in economical way, by comparison with a psychoanalytical seance, let the specters haunt you on the screen." So in other words, Derrida proposed that film goer could save some money since cinematic seance is less expensive than a psychoanalytical one, right? While Derrida foregrounds the spectral and unconscious dimensions of cinema in relation to absence and the return of a repressed or return of a ghost revealed through double projection, another approach to the cinematic seance emphasizes not what is absent, but what is effectively present. To introduce it, I chose to refer to the thoughts expressed by the anthropologist and filmmaker Edgar Morin in his 1962 book, The Cinema or the Imaginary Man. In this book, he frames the film seance as a collective dream. Maureen proposes that cinematic experience is shaped by what he calls the projection identification complex, a reciprocal dynamic in which the viewer projects affective states on the screen while simultaneously internalizing its images into their own psychic reality. Similarly to Derrida, Maureen acknowledges the cinema viewer's state of double consciousness. One, knowing the film is fiction, still emotionally engages with it as if it was real. Projection is built into our very perception, Maureen writes. Yet, in identification, the subject, instead of projecting himself onto the world, absorbs the world into himself. For Maureen, this is not a contradiction, but a very essence of cinema's enchantment. In the movie theater, the spectator is physically immobile, yet psychically open, receptive to the collective reverie unfolding on screen. The screen thus becomes a site of affective projection, merging reality and illusion in a kind of reciprocal process. In other words, the screen becomes a surface for psychic transfer between reality and illusion. Within this setting, cinema revives the logic of animistic belief systems. The spectator, Maureen writes, is alone and not alone, absorbed in solitary reverie with a shared communal space. This condition, he argues, is favorable to suggestion, akin to a state of trance in a magical ride. And we shouldn't forget that Maureen was also an anthropologist and did quite a few field works, and his references to animistic situations is not coming out of blue. Images on the screen are treated as if alive, imbued with spirit or soul, a modern animistic ritual that transforms illusion into emotional, authentic experience. The viewer invests vitality into the filmed image, perceiving it as a double of reality, and thereby enacts a contemporary form of magic. For Maureen, it is precisely this interval between image and reality that becomes the site of cinematic enchantment. He writes, between the image and the double is magic in a nascent state, internalized as sentiment. Animistic affection thus produces enchantment. The spectator's emotional investment in the image creates experience that for Maureen is no less alive than material reality. As this short introduction paves the background for our thinking, Derrida and Maureen offer two complementary visions of a cinematic séance. Although both draw upon psychoanalytical frameworks to explore cinema's logic of double projection, they develop this metaphor in different directions. Derrida emphasizes cinema's spectrality, its haunting absences, and the unconscious and the return of the unconscious. Maureen, by contrast, stresses how the cinematic séance reactivates animistic and affective bonds with the world, akin to collective rituals. In Maureen's view, the séance operates not by confronting one with something absent, but by intensifying the presence of something larger than ourselves, a communal dream in which spectators together invest their psychic energies, animating shadows and images with meaning and emotional truth. Approaching the cinematic séance through these two perspectives, a spectral projection of a repressed and magical identification, for us, and I mean as curators, offers a framework for understanding the séance and informs our curatorial thoughts for the moving image work specifically that we're thinking about for the upcoming Biennale. And here I think it's a perfect moment to return to the works themselves. So in what follows, we have chosen to present a remarkable film that I believe speak to the themes I have just briefly traced in this short presentation. So we will screen now Janjin Kaisen's film Wreckage from 2016. And it's a kind of a film reconciliation, which deals with one's memory, war trauma, and following reconciliation with it. Film reflects on the 1948 Jeju Island massacre, which you all know probably from the recent book that got a Nobel Prize, which was a state-led atrocity which was done together with the American army present in Korea at the time, in which thousands of civilians were killed on the South Korean island, Jeju Island. Many of them buried in unmarked graves or simply lost at sea. And for decades, this event remained officially unacknowledged, leaving behind certain traumatic silence and intergenerational trauma. And the filmmaker approach and artists whom we also have in the panel approaches this history through a very special way, combining underwater footage, performance, and archival material, also editing the sound from the shamanic rituals that the island is known for, to kind of provide a space for a voice for long remained as unspoken. And the film, as you will see, does not recount history in a kind of linear way that some documentaries do, nor offer resolution. Instead, it creates space for, I would say, cinematic seance. And here probably I will end. Enjoy the film.
My name's Hallie. Thank you for coming. So as Anton and Lukas have stated, these are kind of just presentations that are synthesizing some of the research we've done leading up to the Seoul Mediacity Biennale that opens in 2.5 months at the end of August. So one of the topics of our research was about the role of images in spiritual practice and religion. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Okay. So shortly before the holiday season in 1996, a sign appeared on the south side of a building in Clearwater, Florida. Rainbows congealed into the optical simulacra of the Virgin Mary, plastered on high at the Seminole Finance Corporation at the corner of US 19 and Drew Street. Largely believed to have been caused by the corrosion of the metallic coating on the glass, the sign, taken for a wonder, attracted nearly 500,000 devotees within the first few weeks of the Marian figure's divine intervention. Yeah, you see it? Yeah? The owner of the building, unconvinced by the scientific explanations offered by glass experts, decided to protect the image by turning his building into a religious shrine. He sold the building to Shepherds of Christ, a Catholic ministry organization who renamed it Our Lady of Clearwater after the town. Over the next 2 years, they erected a large wooden crucifix adjacent to the corroded Virgin and opened the Rosary Factory in the space that had previously overseen the allocation of preferred equity and debt financing for real estate development. In 2004, a local teen used a slingshot to smash the top panes of glass, effectively beheading the Virgin. This perception of religious imagery in natural phenomena is nothing too extraordinary, not even by Florida standards. Anthropologists have even suggested that the occurrence of such signs may approach a cultural universal, appearing as regularly in belief systems centered around monotheistic religions as in those derived from nature worship, animism, or fetishism. Psychologists, of course, attribute this phenomenon to pareidolia, which is a type of apophenia by which we impose a meaningful interpretation on a nebulous visual stimulus so that one detects an object, a pattern, or a meaning where there is, in fact, none. The idea that certain images can be embedded with meaning or imbued with power is, of course, commonplace. One must merely look to the history of iconoclasm or to the prevalence of talismans or lucky charms or to the academic field surrounding object-oriented ontology or animism to understand the extent to which images and objects are believed not only to represent but also to do. Indeed, In art historian Joseph Leo Kerner's 2004 book on iconoclasm called The Reformation of the Image, he makes note of the fact that with the advent of Martin Luther's priesthood of all believers, a faithful life could be lived by one's individual accord without the trappings of saintly intercessors or ornately manicured churches. This prevailing understanding of the Reformation dictates that the Bible, or the Word of God itself, was deemed to be enough. In Martin Luther's estimation, the church should be less about the physical space of the church and more about the congregation. Indeed, to witness a congregation as it listens to a sermon should be the closest possibility to seeing the true invisible church. While images may be present on an altarpiece, Kerner is invested in analyzing the machinery of actors, actions, and instruments using the image, what he calls the apparatus. Kerner's argument then claims that if the Reformation were truly a movement built on the Word of God alone, then religious imagery would have completely disappeared, even more than the extent of the iconoclasm championed by other sectarian leaders like John Calvin, for instance. Foundational to Kerner's argument is the Wittenberg altarpiece, painted by Lucas Cranach the Elder in 1547, which Kerner uses to illustrate that the image itself performs theological labor. There's a close-up. A reformed image, Kerner argues, is not intended to mediate an experience of the sacred for an individual. This is in stark contrast to the purpose of a religious icon or the visual language of the medieval era. Instead, Kerner suggests that reformed images maintain a sort of self-consciousness in regards to their status as works of art that can only interpret or reflect. The reformed image, it would seem, redirects the viewer's attention back to what is occurring within the physical church itself. This allows the devout to make sense of what Kerner deems the visible invisibility of the church. So if images that appear within explicitly religious context don a new form of religiosity that precludes mediation, then the space for the enchantment of images and objects within the Western world, at least, must be found elsewhere. It's toward this that we can turn to art historian David Friedberg's 1989 tome, The Power of Images, Study in the History and Theory of Response, in which he collapses the supposed distinction between responding to images as aesthetically beautiful and as religiously or magically potent. Citing a widespread cultural reluctance to admit that we respond to images in any way other than intellectually, Friedberg decries iconoclasm and, for that matter, censorship as indicative of an inability to draw a line between reality and the image. According to him, our brains initially respond to figural images as if they were alive. Only afterwards do we measure our response through a reassurance that the image is inanimate. This initial response, he claims, is universal, while the way that we process our response and repress our initial reaction to a figural image is the product of particular cultures and circumstances. This phenomenon persists in contexts where the art histories of religion and spirituality have not been so adamantly defined by an orthodox linearity that casts out aesthetic trends deemed contrary to strident modernism. In Korea, which is where the biennial is, shamanic practices have always relied on shaman paintings as a crucial accoutrement, an innate interweaving between subject and object. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, many Korean shamans across the peninsula sourced the paraphernalia and pictures of gods used in their rituals from the Eastgate Market in Seoul, as this was the period when the government still thought of shamanic practices as superstition, and when crusades against shaman shrines were hardly a thing of the past. So these shops were reluctant to call themselves shaman supply stores. Instead, while they sold items that were obviously used in shamanic rituals, like drums, cymbals, gongs, god paintings, they called themselves purveyors of all kinds of things. So things, objects and images inherently imbued with a pathos that is managed in different ways by different people. This pathos is constructed by the latent capacity for spiritual practice to serve as a technology in and of itself. not a mechanical or financial technology, but a technology with social and political aims. It's precisely this form of spirituality that artists have turned toward as a means of rejecting rapid changes in society, whether on rationalistic or religious lines. As the Western Age of Enlightenment crested into the Age of Industrialization, for example, the rapid transformation of civil society produced by this new technical epoch harbingered a period of extreme anxiety. In this space of stress and alienation, art practices became an outlet for investigation into the effect of this industrialization on the human form, preempting the desire for a way out of hyper-mechanized society. In the contestation of art historian Linda Nochlin, dismembered body parts are apt emblems of this period of rapid industrialization in the West. In her 1994 book, The Body in Pieces, The Fragment as a Metaphor of Modernity, her opening conversation hinges on this drawing from between 1778 to 1780 by Swiss painter Henry Fuseli. The work is entitled The Artist's Despair Before the Grandeur of Ancient Ruins, and depicts an artist in a fit of melancholy, seated in solitary despair and dwarfed by fragments of the Colossus of Constantine at the Capitoline Museums in Rome. The artist's experience of modernity contrasts with the near-divine glory of antiquity, symbolically represented by two imposing simulacra of power, the strapping foot and the hand with index finger outstretched as if issuing a decree. These detached body parts set the stage for Nochlin's discussion of the use of fragmentation, partial images, and mutilation to express grief in a period of uprooted social order and nostalgia for previous epochs characterized by a social continuity for which now we can only yearn. A metaphysical fragmentation, Nochlin writes, seems to mark modern experience, a loss of wholeness, a shattering of connection, a destruction or disintegration of permanent value that is so universally felt in the 19th century as to be often identified with modernity itself. She illustrates this through the work of Degas and Caillebotte, for instance, and their propensity to depict figures sliced or quartered by the edges of the picture plane or in various states of societal disconnect. Other aspects of visual culture were likewise marked by a decisive blurring of the boundaries between the living and the more than human, whether spirit, the unconscious, or the dead. Also during this industrializing era, biotechnical experiments, which were aided by the newfound ability to harness electricity, sparked aspirations of immortality. New chemical techniques for the preservation and embalming of corpses, coupled with the rise of post-mortem photography, brought the dead and living into profoundly close physical space, or what scholar John Troyer has deemed embalmed vision. With eyes clouded by this embalmed vision, the modern corpse becomes atemporal. No longer subject to the biology of decomposition, the post-mortem subject is even deemed worthy of public display through funerary ritual or photographic image. Indeed, with the advent of each new era and form of technology, we careen closer toward closing our symbolic chasm between the living and the dead, or the human and the non-human. In the words of Paul Virilio, quote, "When you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck. When you invent the plane, you also invent the plane crash. And when you invent electricity, you invent electrocution. Every technology carries its own negativity, which is invented at the same time as technical progress," end quote. Our contemporary conception of the triangulation between death and spiritualism has thus been shaped by a cultural imagination struggling to make sense of the advent of industrial technology with the capacity to cause catastrophe on a scale previously unknown, and then also with the capacity to record the aftermath of these catastrophes in forms of image making that can be mechanically reproduced and disseminated. As a result of these contexts, we see the rise of spiritualist movements delineated in the previous two presentations. Whereas this flourishing of spiritualist movements in the West was partly the product of a sense of loss of bodily and spiritual autonomy in light of the realities of Fordism and the regimentation of factory labor around the advent of modernity. In the East, this era of spiritualism and religious sectarianism was also born out of a desire to curb Western influence. Rather than a simple multiplication of new alternative belief systems, scholars and religious practitioners tended to redefine existing folk spiritual practices in accordance with a nationalism that sought to augment a coherent national identity, contrasting a Western influence, while paradoxically vanquishing the folk practices on which that nationalism hinged. So throughout the early 1910s and 20s in China, for example, the Taoyuan sect of Taoism emerged, concurrently with the ancestor-worshipping syncretic religion Cao Dai in Vietnam, and the Korean religion Chandooism, evolving out of the late 1800s Neo-Confucianism academic movement Don Hak, which sought to counter Western influence. This is also the period when Omoto gained popularity, as Anton mentioned, and when clairvoyance, hypnotism, and seances enjoyed a very widespread fascination within Japan, which then exported this trend via cultural exchange to China and Korea. During this period of modernization in the East, ruling elites attempted to eradicate folk practices and faith-based healing remedies, viewing them as hostile to the project of modernization. While public demand for traditional medicine, for example, did not necessarily wane, state authorities gradually demanded a separation of medicine and religion, deeming Western medicine to be the only form of legitimate scientific healing, not because it was Western, but because it was based on empiricism rather than spiritual belief. As a consequence of this advancing empiricism, Japanese scholars who had taken up clairvoyance and hypnotism as serious fields of research were increasingly discounted, with spiritualist experimentation in the name of science waning, and advocates of spiritualism finding it increasingly impossible to espouse scientific explanations that, in the eyes of a dismayed public, bolstered the experience of a spirit world. Instead, spiritualism was painted as an anti-rationalist enemy of the project of national congruence, as the chasm between spiritualism and science grew ever wider. In the Japanese context, Meiji-era ideologue Inoue Enryo, this fellow, was a fastidious investigator of the supernatural, even founding the field of monster studies, or yokai gaku. Part of his primary philosophical project was to reinterpret Buddhist concepts through Western philosophical doctrine as a means of supplanting Western religion by aggrandizing Buddhism on intellectual grounds, thus granting it credence as an acceptable alternative. Through education, the championing of modern medicine, and state legislation, Inoue focused on redirecting the spiritual sentiments of the masses away from heterogeneous complexes of local beliefs in the supernatural and toward a homogenized belief in a unique kokutai, or national essence, found, as he believed, in a kind of singular Buddhism. Oh, a fun fact, in that corner, that woman was a self-declared clairvoyant, and she is who the mother in The Ring is based off of. Anyway. This is a geomancer's map of where to plan the city of Seoul. Throughout the Joseon dynasty in Korea, shamanism had been suppressed by Confucian elites who imposed taxes and legal restrictions on shamans. As Christianity spread throughout the 1800s, it found sympathy among members of the Silhak school, which means practical learning, which was a branch of Neo-Confucianism that advocated for a reforming of the rigid Confucian social structure by which lower classes remained disenfranchised. The Silhak approach championed the use of science and advancing technologies as a means of solving social welfare issues while advocating for a Korean-centric conception of Korean identity and history. Seeing Christianity as a basis for their egalitarianism, the Silhak school laid the groundwork for a later breed of Korean nationalism rooted in Christianity and in opposition to Korean folk belief. During Japanese occupation, actually, many Korean Christians were imprisoned for refusal to worship the Japanese emperor. Though obviously this was motivated by theological rather than political convictions, this phenomenon led to an understanding of Christianity as a kind of bulwark of Korean nationalism. As early modernizers, Silhouette Christians characterized shamanism as superstition and encouraged its suppression, setting up a clear dialectic with science and Christianity teetering strangely together on one side of a seesaw. In these contexts, this nationalist impulse of rejecting Western influence then went hand in hand with a dismissal of folk and spiritualist belief on scientific or empirical grounds, with academic communities that sought to debunk mystics and mediums, offering alternative scientific, medical, or technological explanations to rationalize supernatural phenomena, while political reformers viewed folk practices as impediments to social change. To this end, religious symbols and prayer gradually gained more widespread credibility and acceptance over talismans, spells, or spirit possession rituals. Okay, now for something completely different, we're again faced with increasingly dogmatic distinctions between spiritualism and science, precluding a definition of technology that encompasses the transcendent potential of spiritualist healing practices. In many parts of the world, a rising class of international elite have developed and propagated worldviews in which superstition and obscurantism defy logic, reason, and empiricism. Political leaders turned spiritual prophets and religious figures transgressing into government have begun to offer magical and conspiratorial solutions to contemporary quagmires, tethering their belief systems to a reaction against medicine, evidence, and scientific inquiry. In this era, our era, an onslaught of technological innovation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithmically mediated data, whether factual or not, serves as a means through which we might be duped into perceiving reality. However, as the poet Wallace Stevens reminds us, there are naturally charlatans of the irrational. That, however, does not require us to identify the irrational with the charlatans. Shortly after Helena Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, she produced two books that became foundational to her movement: Isis Unveiled in 1877 and The Secret Doctrine in 1888. In her text, she outlines the grand claim that Theosophy had devised a means of quelling the antagonism between science and spiritualism that had been caused by Darwin's theory of evolution. Blavatsky applied the theory of evolution onto humanity's spiritual life in the same way that scholars were then contending with evolution and its ramifications on physical or biological life. Historian James Webb, in his The Occult Underground, outlines Blavatsky's conjecture. Quote, "Man had evolved from apes, perhaps, but he had a noble destiny. Just as Homo sapiens had evolved from a lower form of animal life, and that form in its turn from a vegetable, protoplastic, or unicellular existence, man, as at present constituted, was on his way to higher and better things. Evolution continued on a cosmic scale, with each individual born and reborn thousands of times until he had achieved earthly perfection." End quote. Blavatsky's decree for art was a spiritual imperative, one that fused mysticism and aesthetics to produce material objects for visual contemplation. In some distant era, art could even perhaps become pure spirit, untethered by the material plane. In the present, the propulsion of the artist mystic, or indeed of any religious or spiritual believer who claims a deep knowledge of human destiny, is to produce, materially, innovation that accords with a spiritual calling. If one mission of theosophy could be located in a theoretical merging of contemporaneous paradigm-shifting notions within scientific inquiry, with established orders of religious doctrine, i.e. an evolution of the spirit, then we might frame a technology of the spirit as a reckoning with the capacity for image and art-making practices to continue to underscore a spiritual pathos that defies modernizing attempts at a separation between body and soul. To this end, we might look at the history of modernization not as a series of suppressions of spiritual practice, but as an illustration of spiritual practices adamantly reincorporating the image into an enchantment of everyday life. That's it for me. We will screen now Whispering Pines 9, which is a film from 2009 by the filmmaker Shauna Moulton. In it, you will see her play her alter ego, Cynthia. And Cynthia has a kind of obsession with the way that spiritual practices have been commodified into a wellness industry. Thank you.
Now I will do a short kind of proposition titled Séance as Technology of Disalienation. So in my short presentation, I would like to explore the potentialities of a séance as simultaneously a cinematic and therapeutic or even psychoanalytic séance in the context of the radical psychiatry movement known as institutional psychotherapy. The movement was initiated during the Résistance and the German occupation of southern France. The movement was initiated during the Résistance and the German occupation in southern France at the peripheral hospital of Saint-Albin in the department of Lozère. The hospital became a refuge for Jewish migrants, resistance fighters, and surrealist artists, including Georges Canguilhem, Paul Éluard, and Nouchi Éluard, Tristan Tzara, and many others. Since the early 1950s, media practices such as filming, recording, and printing press, but also cineclubs and the production of an intra-hospital newspaper titled Trait d'Union, were integrated as therapeutic techniques and became part of the collective reinvention of the clinic. A very special séance took place on June 2nd, 1961, in the same department of Lozère, at the cinema of Saint-Chély-d'Apcher, near the Saint-Albin clinic. The screening was organized at the request of François Toscaïès, a militant anarchist doctor in exile who was one of the main initiators of institutional psychotherapy. With an audience composed of psychiatric patients, nurses and doctors, farmers and local villagers, 2 films were screened and discussed afterwards. First, The Mad Masters by pioneer of ethnographic cinema Jean Rouch, and Chronicle of a Summer by Rouch and sociologist Edgar Morin. The Mad Masters, banned in France shortly after its completion in 1955, features the possession rituals and trance states of the Hauka movement in the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, performed by African workers and migrants who embody and subvert European colonial figures. Chronicles of a Summer, by contrast, is another ethnographic film that focuses on everyday life in Paris. It features intimate exchanges and convivial group discussions with factory workers, students, artists, and immigrants. Issues of modern alienation and happiness amid racism, colonial wars, and Holocaust trauma are both topics of discussions and symptoms inscribed in the film bodies and environments. This founding film of Cinéma Vérité explores the limits of truth and participation in cinema, undoing the boundary between camera and film subjects, documentary and fiction. At the same time, the film was not yet officially released in cinemas in Paris, so when the screening or the séance took place, to which I want to allude. So the Saint-Albin screening can be seen as a peculiar avant-premiere of the film. One could ask, why showing these 2 experimental avant-garde films in to the rural population in the peripheral southern France? What role could a patient's or doctor's account play in the film's political or aesthetic impacts? The archives of the production company Argos, which sent the film copies to Saint-Albin, preserve a report of the discussion which took place shortly after the screening. The viewers emphasize the unique relation between the camera and the lived experience, but also the experimental use of sound. While Toscaïès offers a psychoanalytic reading of Chronicle of a Summer, highlighting the sexual subtext of certain details, one of the patients admires the use of non-professional actors, and I quote him, You don't need to be an actor to become a star. It's within everyone's reach. Such statements recall the political horizon of early Soviet films, which were screened in internal cineclubs at the hospital, programmed partly also by patients. These films rejected theatrical acting in favor of cinema as a tool for constructing and transforming life. The Séance with Jean Rouch and Morin in 1961, but also the experimental use of media at Saint-Albin, can be seen as part of a collective therapeutic technology, as intervention into the mental and social environment of the clinic. So in the following, I try to argue for this practice as a technology of disalienation. Institutional psychotherapy, before pursuing any individual treatment, sought to cure the surrounding and the hospital. Drawing attention to the fact that the hospital is ill, the goal was to modulate the environment and the ambience and atmosphere of the clinic itself. It considered madness to be a disorder in the relationship between the self and the world. To be mad in French means aliéné. Alienation was here conceptualized as a double estrangement, both mental and social alienation of the self from its participation in the environment. Undertaking a Marxist rereading of psychoanalysis, institutional psychotherapy operated via group therapies and radical restructuring of the psychiatric institutions, involving patients as active participants in each other's healing processes. So the time of the Séance with Rouch and Morin and Saint-Albin, another trilogy of Cinéma Vérité was produced in Lozère by Italian-French filmmaker Mario Ruspoli, in close collaboration with Toscaïez. Two of these films were dedicated to the life of Saint-Albin Clinic, an insight into madness and the prisoner's party. Both works avoid voiceover explanation of or clinical discourse, creating instead an atmosphere of attention and presence in the complex environment marked by institutional transformations. Ruspoli's camera pays close attention to the rhythm of the life inside the institution, the textures of bodies, materials, and the spaces of care and disalienation. According to Toscaïez, these films, and I quote him here, venture to make you truly participate in the lives of these human beings, in their anxieties, their hopes, and their struggle, and reconnect with reality, with the social world, with everyday life, a struggle shared by doctors and patients alike. And you see that he uses participer dans la vérité à la vie. It's kind of alluding to Cinéma Vérité before even it was released as a movement or it kind of was established. So what is the nature of this technologically or cinematically mediated participation? In the first place, it was a mediated redefinition of the psychoanalytic notion of transference or Übertragung, which Lukas referred to previously. So a redefinition of this Übertragung towards a collective and milieu-generative dimension. In the second place, I would like to suggest here that this form of participation, explored at Saint-Albin as a cinematic mediation of transference, significantly influenced the methods and aesthetic language of Cinéma Vérité. In this way, the therapeutic techniques of institutional psychotherapy played a significant role in the aesthetic, formal, and political stakes of Cinéma Vérité. The broader implications of this understanding of film and media as montage of mental ecologies are explored collectively in our research project Madness Media Milieus by Camilla Cagliotti, Marlo Miguel, Felix Briedel, and Christian Scherhorn, who are all present here, and I'm happy to share this collective knowledge here. So by concluding, I would like to show in juxtaposition the final episodes of two films. On the right is the aforementioned Prisoner Party by Ruspoli, and on the left is Lozerian Society of Mental Hygiene, a film made 4 years prior to Ruspoli in 1957 by Toscaïez, his wife Elena Ayres, and the patients of Saint-Albin. I will comment on this in a second. Technologies of disalienation in Saint-Albin need to be seen as grounded in a mediated and praxeological redefinition of transference, understood as the patient's capacity to play an active role in one another's healing processes. In this context, Übertragung was no longer a binary patient-doctor relation, but a multiplied constellation in the collective, social, and environmental extensions of the entire institution. As psychiatrist Pierre de Lyon emphasized, it was about accounting for the specificity of psychosis and re-establishing a metapsychology of transference according to its measure. At the time, for Dostoevsky, this implied an ethical and political process of deprofessionalization, considering the communal situation of a clinic in contrast to the psychoanalytic setting of an interpersonal cure. He wrote, I quote him, "Psychotherapy was truly the work of everyone and not just of psychoanalysts." This redefined model of psychoanalysis in turn crucially exceeded the notion of the unconscious as based on language. It allowed to account for bodily movements and gestures as agents of transferential constellations, as theorized also by Jean Noury, the founder of La Borde Clinic. Dostoevsky spoke of multi-referential transference, which implied that transferential investments can also be deployed on objects and spaces. The fundamental awareness of the spatial and aesthetic dimensions in therapy opened institutional psychotherapy to cinematic processuality and mediation, with its valorization of the perceptual field and its structuring forces. Broadening the psychoanalytic vocabulary, institutional psychotherapy proposed an analysis of C2M as a spatial equivalent of phoneme, in order to account for the complexity of a transferential situation, of situated bodies and gestures, velocities, and sounds that play an essential role in social environments. Guattari later adapted the idea of a spatial heterogenesis of relations in his own concept of transversality. So I'm concluding here just to say that this transversality of relations is multiplied in the juxtaposed film episodes on screen. Both final episodes present the annual Fête Votive celebrations at Saint-Albin, dedicated to the region's saint. The film allows not only to mediate the complex temporality of the objects and bodies presented, the costumes and masks made by the patients during the ergotherapy sessions, the theatrical and musical performances, the previously rehearsed in ateliers and featured in both films. Both films present the environmental and social opening of the clinic, a geopsychiatric transference, when we see the celebration joined by the inhabitants of Lozère. The social transversality dismantles the opposition between the normal and the pathological in favor of coexisting singularities as explored by Georges Canguilhem, a Lozérian society, which was also emphasized in Dostoevsky's film title. Finally, I would like to suggest that a form of transference occurs between these two films, one that links the gestures and movements of the carnivalesque collectives not only with one another or with the act of capturing them on film, but also with the transmission of these situated experiences into an open temporality of the future, where new and other technologies of disalienation may unfold. Thank you.
So I'm presenting another type of a concept, or close crossing concepts, which is called cine-somatic, and combines cine, the movement, soma, the body, and matrix, matriciality, coming actually from mater, the mother, and is connected to machinic animism. But I start with, so you can see most of the ideas that I present today are coming from this book about my work in the exhibition in Reina Sofia 2 years ago. But let me say I combine a few ideas from The authors that I invited, namely Lazzarato, of course, Maurizio Lazzarato, and others like Aranzao, very important meeting. And so I start with the passage. The passage. In his book on Baudelaire's poetry, Walter Benjamin calls the experience of modernity a passage. His last work, the Passagen work, remained unfinished, but his analysis of Baudelaire's poem, À une passante, became a signifier of modernity as a fugitive, ephemeral, and hypnotizing trance experience related to the deterritorialized city machine. La Fugitive describes a man who recognizes a woman, an encounter in the streets, in an unsustainable flow of persons. And this encounter that could have taken place did not take place, but it could have changed his fate. But this event was lost due to the mass movements of people. This loss awakens the desire to intensify our memory work and intellectual efforts that try to build stops, intervals in the flow, to slow down time in memory, and at least to shift our body positions so that we can change our perspective. We can change our perspective by moving our position in the space. We can change our thinking and our vision. This is what we will hear with the words of the now famous revolutionary Catalan psychiatrist François Tosquelles, who says, "We first act with the body and then the thinking follows." He called that a thinking with the feet. So Deconage talks about the conception of the migrant work of geopsychiatry invented by Tosquelles, the syndicalist anarchist psychiatrist, and results from the cooperative revolutions of the 30s in Catalonia. Félix Guattari's practice in Laborde later was largely inspired by Tosquelles' geopsychiatry. Our, Maurizio Lazzarato and my, work on Guattari's interest in animist cosmologies and the concept of a machinic animism is related. Deconage was conceived as an experimental form of an interlinked archival survey about the institutional psychotherapy invented in Saint-Alban during the Second World War. The aesthetic conception of the video installation deepens and reflects Tosquelles' extra-analytical methods in psychoanalysis, which he described as a form of fooling around, a practice of non-verbal association and intervention. It introduces an artistic proposal for a digital cartography within a deferred conversation. It is based on a video interview from 1987, and I'm sure about it, that psychiatrist Daniel Sivardon, filmmaker François Pin, and psychoanalyst Jean-Claude Pollack recorded over the period of 3 days with Tosquelles. So then, much later, in 2011, philosopher Elisabeth von Samsonov from Vienna and the psychoanalyst of Jean-Claude Pollack, who was at the interview in 87, were shown video excerpts, namely 45 minutes, that was edited from this 20 hours of raw footage with Tosquelles. While listening to this edited speech, they were given a permission to use the pause button of the video player and to interrupt the narrative whenever they wanted. The setting resembles a virtual philosophical psychoanalytical session that is triggered by psychomotor reactions of the viewers who are manually using the start and pause function of the player. This method elaborates an artistic language from digital editing, which I use as an analytical tool to render the extralingual connectivity triggered by or in a speech act. The link, click, shot, and cut in the editing becomes a cartographic element, switching from a conversation to an archival survey, from one conversation to another. In the installation, A luminous projection screen, I will go behind here, flickers with abstract colored light and complements the composed image with the three speakers on the screen above. The luminous image is rendered through a single enlarged pixel from the image of one's speaker's face. The flickering rhythm of the light field abstracts the movement of the speaker. So these are so-called myokinetic movements. Myokinetic research emerged as a practice of psychodiagnosis. So it's basically an analysis of psychometric matters that did not rely on language because, as Toscoyev's teacher Mira I. Lopez stated, it refers to the term of myopsyche as an instinctive psychomotor adaptation of the body to the environment. For Mira and Toscoyev, it was proven that the body that senses the world first and before language. Toscoyev is convinced that the mind follows the body while passing through a moving ensemble of human and non-human enunciations. The fact that the body acts prior to the mind leads to Toscoyev's conviction that the freedom of movement is an essential human right, namely the human right to wander free. The human is a creature, Toscoyev says, that goes from one space to another. She cannot stay all the time in the same space. You had to leave your cradle, and they even forced you out so as to go somewhere else, to get different things. That's to say that the human is always a pilgrim, a creature who goes elsewhere. Walter Benjamin did not speak of migration or flight when he described the passage as a state of mind in modern cities, machines, that alienates and prepares for the desire of existential connections. But the fleeting ephemeral experiences are particularly vivid in the passage of migration. A capture and cartographic logic during a passage emerges when the camera eye or other sensors are attached to the moving bodies. The desire for connectivity points to an experience of loss or show a partial subject matter. With image technologies, we are integrating them into our memory actualizations. It shows the tendency of our constant participation in the world. Through that, we can communicate with an outside, the so-called exoplane of our existence, but as part of the whole. Endo and exo relations structure anthropological research. But with film and image technologies, an in-betweenness or matriciality appears as a position in the fluctuating waves of sound and images. This is why film is qualified as a skin, as an in-betweenness, as simultaneously being part of the subject and the object orders. The camera perspective is always partial, incomplete. It is matrix-like, because a camera image is both an inside and an outside, or it refers to other nonlinear orders, to other temporalities, towards other images. This connecting quality is specific to electronic media and to film, of course. This cine-somatic condition shifts the triangle of representation, notation, and construction to create a culture whose field of reference is the body of the earth. The philosopher Aranzawa Zarazaga Aregi, in her article for the book Cine-Somatic on my work, the article is called When the Camera Eye Descends into Deep Earth and Speak into Languages of Participation, Matricial Weaving for a Political Autonomy. So she writes that assemblages of utterances are in relation participation with others, which in turn participate in something else. Cine-somatrical language relations are partial. The field of connectivity is intensive. Matricial means also the horizontal and vertical orders which refer to the work of montage, to a process of storytelling that simultaneously depicts the world while alternating its meaning. The process, which I call a parsing, transgresses subject-object orders. Conditions of escape always interested me as an epiphany, a call to the outside, an undercurrent, latent storytelling process that builds new subjectivities that constantly reflect the space around oneself, the Umwelt, which in return answers this reflection and calls back. In digital editing, we sense the virtual powers of the present time and answer them by calling upon different past tenses. What was just before now? What follows now? We work the matricial potential of connecting temporalities. My video passing drama is neither an autobiographical account of escape, nor about a history with the big H, but an essay whose story of escape, flight, and genocide was transmitted over 3 generations and had been retold in 4 countries. It is a completely fragmented narrative of interwoven micro-perceptions that reconnect to different mnemonic paths, weaving together different temporalities, rhythm, and voice melodies. So in the film, each place becomes a specific temporal milieu, influencing, breaking into others, and forming a woven structure. This woven picture is not a story with a beginning and an end, but a non-linear concatenation of different speeds that are created again through the reaction of my hand, the psychomotor reaction of my hand, on the speed wheel in editing in the analog studio, like a DJ on a turntable, and the extremely laborious weaving process of nonlinear editing. As Elisabeth von Samsonov remarks in her article, Conversations with Friends, revealing the minoritarian quality of expression is a sublime interpretation. It changes the visible, it questions the visible, and then something happens, namely the world responds, the world becomes epiphanic. It's a kind of psychonautism that is exercised through image technology. That's the power of the films, the real answering and affirmation of the social responsiveness of the world. A fragmented partial connectivity results from the not yet told stories in passing drama because of the genocidal, referring to the genocidal epochs in European history that ruled over migration histories by separating people's moving stories from national state history. So in film, the weaving is a kind of antidote because the recorded time means that there is a kind of reiteration of past tenses, and this is contracting in the flux of the present time. A form of actualization or memory work takes place. But this is not just on the film, this is also the apparatus, the body, and the machine, and the use of it. This is an image of the concept of matter and matière mémoire from Henry Bergson, who says many things, but to make it short, the densest form of the past is the present, and you can see it on the different past tenses that kind of meet the present flux and actualize in this present flux. For Bergson, our intellectual effort, or spiritual effort, activates our memory by forming time, stretching and composing it, building intervals, and that This forming memory matters because it forms the world. For Bergson, all matters is a form of time. A landscape is a formed time matter. When we pass a landscape, we leave traces and we collect knowledges of other traces. Thus, a landscape is an archive and can be activated or communicated with. I see that the inclusion in film matters of forgetting, of incompleteness, of interruption, of rupture, of loss and fragmentation, states of the mind that are considered psychopathological, in film is very important for the participative quality of the narrative. These are exactly evicted by mainstream media propaganda that forms the national memory politics. The mainstream media propaganda is a machine that hides reason of flight and migration, of course, and operates within the worst ethnical cleansing and genocidal politics of today, but it first of all devaluates migration stories as partial, non-complete, non-scientific, or not proven in relation to a consensual, opinioned national history. State media propaganda forces people to integrate themselves into the tabula rasa of modern nation-state history, accepting forms of racism and supremacy. It operates also through huge media infrastructural expansion politics. But there is an antidote. Machines are crystallizing time, so that do present the fleeting nature of the passage. Non-linear time that has different densities and proceed through image technologies. But it is important to disidentify with representation and instead encompassing unpredictable events for inhabiting a partial, incomplete, non-patriarchal minor subject position in the image production. So I will kind of also refer to the book Video Philosophy by Maurizio Lazzarato on our long-standing conversation, where he says that the camera and video are both recording movements, vibrations, and velocities that human consciousness cannot capture. The world is composed of an infinitive multiplicity of fluxes in which it is impossible to differentiate between matter, energy, and light. Within this world, fluxes intersect, overlap, compose, and decompose. The world is not what is, but what happens. It is more an event than a fact or a thing. The world is a constant state of emergence, meaning that it constructs itself. The world is not already there, it is a process in the act of accomplishment, that is, of composing and decomposing it with a multiplicity of human and non-humans. This way of regarding the world, not as a whole, but as something fragmented, composed of bits, pieces, segments, whose composition remains to be carried out, this time of this process is a present that grows upon itself. The machine, as a technical individual, is not a thing or a simple object, nor it is an objectivation of human activity. It is a mode of existence, which is additional and parallel to the human mode of existence. Neither of these terms can function autonomously, independent from each other. The machine is open in different ways because it is itself a relation and a multiplicity of relations. Relation to its own components, relation to other machines, relation to the world and the environment, and to the human. This technical being, according to Simondon, is the relation. It resides in the fact that the relation has the value of being. It has a double genetic function towards human and towards the machine. Whereas even in contemporary critical thought, machine and man are already entirely constituted and defined. If the machine is open, if the machine is a relation, it contains a margin of indeterminacy, Its individuation is not given once and for all, because its functioning is adaptable, not rigidly constituted, like that of an automaton, which for these reasons represents a more inferior type of technology. One can conceive of human subjectivity, who cannot conceive of human subjectivity without the intervention of non-human sources of subjectivation. Digital editing is a nonlinear weaving practice, but what is the order of such a hypertextual organization in a narrative? It is an order that your attention must navigate from junction to junction, link to link, from process to combination to another. So the weaving of every individual singular element in a series, in all the singular details, constitutes a technical, aesthetic, epistemological, political, and machine practice. This molecular conception of the image and of the world is not just an ontology. It is to conceive of beings through these micro-movements, through their vibrations, and so to think of them as being continuously different from the past and continuously emerging in the present time. This is then, and immediately, a politics, a micropolitics. Minorities and majorities exist in distinct temporalities. Majoritarian production dominates through a continuous time, in a linear succession of times, the past, which determines the present, and the present, which goes towards the future. The present is a condition of the future, like a vector for what is to come. Migrations proceed in leaps, in ruptures, and discontinuities in time and space. The unpredictable, the unknown, the non-programmable cannot be clearly anticipated. Migrants do not trace the shortest line from one point to another, but are made up of detours, deviations, and unpredictable bifurcations. So the technical machine has also a micropolitical function that can cure, that can help piece together the fragments of a divided reality. The machine traces a process through which traumatized subjectivities can be reconstructed differently. So we cannot revolt against the society of the spectacle, against the continuous production of the main media that subjugate us without machines, for the machine works in depth on the components of subjectivity, its affects, memory, and relationships. Migration is itself an agency or machine about associating yourself with the other. The autonomy of migration has a healing role, and without the freedom where to set the foot, our mind and thoughts would be stuck as well. The autonomy of migration is a vital reflex. It bears matricial earth dimensions, developing participation and communal visions. So another antidote, machinic animism. Maurizio and me focused on the question on animism, especially its importance for the psychiatrist and philosopher Felix Guattari. He was convinced that animism, far from being a return to irrationalism, is a way to overcome and neutralize the ontological dualism of modernity that have become the main source of many of the contemporary political, ecological, social, scientific, and aesthetical problems. One of these ontological dualisms is the inside-outside dichotomy, leading to the nature-culture dichotomy, to life-death dichotomy, and many other conceptions of anthropocentric thought. In our audiovisual essay installation Assemblages and the Life of Particles, Two Maps and Decollage, we followed Guattari's travels and traces to Brazil and to Japan, where he was 8 times each time, because he was interested in the animist cosmological thinking that he thought could be relevant for building a resistance against world-integrated capitalism and the norms and homogenization of our subjectivities. So I show you, this is the installation of the assemblages, and I will show you an excerpt from the beginning, starting with Fernand Deligny, who was a therapist working with autist children near Saint-Alban, not far from it, and maybe in the same times. And his cinema is called the Cinema of Fernand Deligny because it involved so many people to work, José Manenti, others. That is a group of people, it's not just him. These films are a very fine example of audiovisual research, I would say, especially the way that the camera was inhabiting the milieu in that these people were living. Here, just a few words post showing kind of a still from matrilinear B-surfacing Earth with Diane Bell, an Australian feminist anthropologist, who explains the ancient culture and its cartographic work of mapping in the environment, but with a spiritual understanding, because in that storytelling process, he shows this weaving, that is a storytelling where women are weaving it, the weaving starts with the navel, which is where our life starts, and that's what she pointed at, so the story starts there. And she says, in this whole thing, this cultural techniques, each component participates in the inner relationship of the great matrix. Each trace is matricial in that it indicates an intimate participation, and matriciality is not only about techniques of observing and visualizing the earth from without, but from observing and visualizing its inner fabric. And matriciality is both an inside-outside, which sees separations as a subordinate order. Matricial alliances are cosmological of the living, which is in constant mode of reconnecting to the earth, the great matrix. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thanks to all the participants, and especially also to our audiences who stayed despite the delay we accumulated. So since we are really a bit late, so we had this proposition to basically transpose the Q&A and the discussion on the rooftop of the ICI, which is really magnificent, and to exchange there in a less formal way. So thank you so much again, and see you on the rooftop with refreshments.